Hey friends, welcome to another Monday Musing, where we take a topic suggested by somebody in our community and just break it down and in a raw, unedited fashion, try to figure out what is going to fall out. Today's topic is brought to us by player and supporter of the channel, Spencer, who asks, taking too long on turns, acceptable or not? Frankly, it really is to some degree a little bit unavoidable that some people are going to take different amounts of time on their turn to others. If anybody has been around a handful of combats, then they know that the full-on spellcasters have an absolutely dizzying array of options available to them on a round-by-round basis, which sometimes leads some of our characters, or rather our players, to be stuck in the decision-making phase for a lot longer than we would perhaps like. Honestly, also, our fighters with their action surges and Matt Mercer-esque options available to them can also take a pretty stinking long time. Echo Knight, I'm looking at you. But the question about whether or not it's acceptable for people to take quote-unquote too long on their turns sort of falls into a really dark gray area that requires a ton of judgment by the Dungeon Master on any given situation. Certainly it's different around the table with family than it's going to be with a group of relative strangers, than it is with a group of close friends, than it is with paid customers in the pro GM space. All of those things are going to adjust just how acceptable taking too long is, but also too long is super variable based on the class of the character, the choices and decision-making capabilities of the player, how experienced they are. It gets to be quite a morass of qualifiers that can be challenging to sort of navigate to decide whether or not somebody's taking too long. When in doubt, you should almost always err on the side of caution as a DM that people might actually require the amount of time that they spend. That said, I definitely sympathize with the idea of something having taken too long, particularly since, from the DM's side of the screen, where we're hyper-focused on the feeling that we're putting out and the pace of the encounter that we're trying to set, sometimes we're blazing through our round, trying to go as quickly as we possibly can through the monster's actions in order to speed up the pace and thus increase the tension. And then we run into that one player who reads at the time that it gets around to their turn every option that's potentially available and doesn't seem to know necessarily what they are going to do, even though they have, quote-unquote, had the whole round to think about it. Some players really don't have the whole round to think about it because they're engaged in what other people are doing and what the monsters are doing, and they feel like they need to have all of the information on hand before they make a decision. And it's a tough stance to take to say that that's not okay and that they have to have their answer immediately or else you're going to skip on. That said, sometimes that's the answer. Sometimes in your gaming group, it might not be acceptable for people to take a particularly long period of time, and maybe they do need to have a go-to action or be skipped in the initiative until they've figured out what they're going to do and slotted back in, breaking those initiative rules a little bit so that they can take that moment to think about it can be good for them, and it can also feel like a punishment that might motivate some people, but it might demotivate others. There's no one answer that is really good to give when it comes to how long a player should have. I've tried all sorts of tricks over the hundreds and hundreds of games that I've played in the last couple of years. I've tried the method of just picking on people and barking the extra, like, what do you do, this is happening, you don't have time to think, blah blah blah. I've tried the egg timer trick of giving only a certain number of seconds or minutes for people to make their decisions. I've tried skipping people who aren't immediately ready and coming back to them. Pretty much I've done most of the suggestions that I have read out there and given them a go at one point or another, and ultimately I would say that none of them is a fix-all for every group. Some of them help with some pieces of the puzzle for different groups, but if you're looking for a blazing fast combat that requires people to instantaneously know what their characters are going to do, then ultimately, I would say take care, take caution, and address that literally at session 0. Before anything is going to happen, make it clear that that is what you're looking for, and in the process of that, maybe you can help players to make characters that are going to be simple enough to run in that matter. Because we don't want to push for speed in order to hurriedly get through as much content as possible and to increase that narrative tension and pace as much as possible if what we're also doing is making one or two or all of our players miserable and make it to where they're not enjoying their time at the table. Something that I used to fall into an awful lot was thinking that everybody has fun the same way that I have fun. And while I think it would be fun to have pressure put on me and to have to make snappy, quick decisions, in fact, I find it fun when that is a self-imposed condition that I put on myself as a DM. I'm not everybody, and everybody is not me. And so when we take a look at the players that are around our table, we can start to realize that there are going to be a handful of people there that maybe would shine in that sort of a situation, but there's also going to be one or two people, perhaps, that might find that a major turnoff, and it might actually spoil their experience. So is it okay to take too long? Honestly, sometimes, yes, but not always. And so you really have to use your judgment, and you're going to have to adjust the tactics that you use. It can be a good idea to find a way to reward people for taking swift actions rather than finding ways to punish those who are not able to do so. But even then, you start to have that haves and have-nots. Haves and have-nots. That was harder to say than I thought it would be. Between the fast people and those who just need time to deliberate on their actions. Ultimately, if your players are having fun around the table, I wouldn't worry about it too much, but I would focus instead on setting the standard by being as fast as you can possibly be on your turn. Because at one point, when I was really complaining about how long it took my family to take their turns, my family snuck around and timed me, and ultimately the person who was taking the longest turns was the DM. And not just because I had lots of creatures, but in fact just because I had the occasional monster or creature that was a little bit on the complicated side, and maybe I hadn't reviewed them as well as I should, and so I needed that time in order to understand what options were available so that I could provide a nice tense battle, and thus I was the slowdown. So take a look at yourself, find ways to speed your own actions up, and trust that even if things do fall to a little bit of a narrative lull while you're waiting for a player to take their action, you can then ramp it back up quickly with a snappy narration of what's actually happening and a couple of quick moves from the NPCs and monsters that you've got in the field so that you can then bring the pace back up to where it's at in order to keep things exciting and fun and fresh for everyone around the table. I hope that helps. I realize it's not a definitive answer and something that's just going to fix it. So I'm sorry, Spence. That's what you get from me on this one. If anybody else has a comment on how you have sped up combat at your table or helped those people who seem to take too long, please dive into the community here, leave a comment, and help us all out so that we can all improve our games of Dungeons & Dragons. Thanks for watching. Happy adventuring.